The air was heavy with the scent of decay, a sickly mix of scorched earth and dying flora. Vareshi 7 had once been a vibrant world, teeming with life that had thrived in the balance of its ecosystem. Now the land lay cracked and barren, a casualty of corporate greed. Dr. Elias Carter stood at the edge of what had once been a great river, now reduced to a shallow trickle of brackish water. The corpses of small creatures littered the banks, things that had relied on the river for survival but had not adapted quickly enough to its betrayal. His fingers twitched as he recorded his observations, voice flat despite the gravity of what he witnessed. Ecosystem collapse reaching terminal phase, flora degradation at 80%, fauna at risk of total extinction within the next cycle. No signs of large predator activity in over 6 months. He paused, lowering the recorder. The Vareshi wolves, once the apex predators of this world, they had been systematically exterminated. Their bodies turned into trophies and their land transformed into excavation sites. Elias had never seen one alive, not in the flesh, only in ancient footage and the remains catalogued in the database. To the corporations, they had been just another obstacle, another inefficiency to be corrected. A distant howl cut through the evening air, low, mournful, almost spectral. Elias stiffened, ears straining, against the silence that followed. It couldn't be. The last confirmed sighting had been cycles ago, but his instincts, sharpened by years of studying dying worlds, screamed otherwise. He moved quickly, navigating through the skeletal remains of once great trees, their twisted forms casting long shadows under Vareshi 7's setting sun. His boots crunched against the brittle foliage, a sound that made him grit his teeth. Stealth was a lost cause. Then he saw it. A motionless form lay partially concealed beneath the roots of a collapsed tree. Fur, dark as the void between stars, marred with blood and caked in dust. Its breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven movements. Elias felt something primal stir within him, an instinct older than reason, deeper than logic. He should report this. He should leave it. But as he stepped closer, he saw the intelligence behind those half-lidded eyes, the flicker of something beyond mere animal awareness. This was not just a dying predator. This was the last of its kind. His hands moved before his mind had fully decided, reaching into his satchel for supplies. A makeshift syringe, filled with a cocktail of stabilizers and pain suppressants. He injected it just beneath the matted fur, watching as the creature barely flinched. He had seen that kind of exhaustion before, in creatures that had already accepted death. Not yet, he thought. Not if I can help it. Elias worked quickly, ignoring the way his pulse thundered in his ears. He cleaned the wounds as best he could, noting deep lacerations that suggested a struggle. Against what, he couldn't yet determine. The corporations had declared the Vareshi a biological hazard, eradicating them with brutal efficiency. If this one had survived, there had to be a reason. The creature, no, the wolf, shifted slightly, its body responding to the treatment. Its eyes flickered open for the briefest moment, and Elias swore he saw something that unsettled him to his core. Not just pain, not just awareness, recognition. The wind howled through the ruined landscape, carrying with it the ghosts of a once thriving world. Elias knew what he had just done was more than an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war. The corporation would come for him. The moment they discovered he had saved this creature, they would brand him a criminal, a traitor to their sterile vision of progress. He didn't care. Some things were worth fighting for. The air was growing colder, the artificial twilight of Vareshi 7 casting eerie shadows across the broken terrain. Elias stayed close to the creature, watching for any signs of worsening distress. He had done what he could to stabilize it, but he knew the real danger was yet to come. The Vareshi wolf stirred, a low, guttural sound escaping its throat. Its eyes, a luminous shade of violet, flickered open with a slow deliberation that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Intelligence stared back at him, not the primal cunning of a predator, but something deeper, something ancient. He exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're awake." The wolf made no move to attack, no sign of aggression. It was watching him as if assessing, weighing the situation. Its body trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. Elias could see the deep gashes along its flanks more clearly now. These weren't just injuries from scavengers or the harsh environment. These were deliberate wounds. Something or someone had tried to kill it. His fingers brushed against his holster out of reflex, though he knew a gun wouldn't do him much good if the corporation's forces were already tracking him. A sharp pulse ran through his temples, like a static charge building up behind his eyes. It wasn't pain exactly, but it was something unnatural. He jerked back instinctively, but the sensation didn't fade. Then, for the first time, a voice, not his own, spoke within his mind. "You are not them." The words were fragmented, the thoughts raw and unfamiliar, but the meaning was clear. Elias felt his breath hitch. Telepathy. The Vareshi were telepathic. Of course, the corporation had labeled them biological hazards, but they never disclosed why. They had made sure no survivors remained to expose the truth. Elias steadied himself. "I'm not with them." The wolf's gaze didn't waver. Its body was still weak, its breathing ragged, but it remained fixated on him. Then why save me? Elias hesitated. How could he explain it? That he had watched too many species vanish from the universe? That he was tired of being nothing more than an observer of extinction? That maybe, just maybe, he saw something in this dying creature that reminded him of himself? "I don't know," he admitted. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was charged with meaning, with understanding. Then the wolf stirred, trying to push itself upright, but its limbs betrayed it. Elias instinctively reached out, hands catching its weight before it collapsed again. The contact sent another sharp wave through his skull, stronger this time, like 1,000 whispered voices pressed against his consciousness. He gritted his teeth. Visions bled into his mind, a world before devastation, forests of violet canopy, stretching endlessly, packs of Vareshi running together beneath twin moons. A society, not just of hunters, but of guardians. And then fire, machines, the slaughter. Elias yanked himself back with a gasp. His own hands were shaking. The Vareshi's eyes dimmed slightly, exhaustion dragging it back into unconsciousness. But the connection remained. The bond had been formed, and Elias knew then this wasn't just about saving a dying creature. This was about restoring what had been stolen. This was war. Elias barely slept that night, the weight of his decision, pressing against his chest like an iron weight. The Vareshi wolf, Aeyla. That was the name that had settled in his mind after their telepathic exchange. It wasn't spoken in words, but in something deeper, more fundamental. A name carried through echoes of a past nearly erased. She slept fitfully, her body still weak from blood loss and exhaustion. He had done what he could, stitched the worst wounds, stabilized her vitals, but the truth gnawed at him. If he stayed here much longer, the corporation's surveillance drones would find them. His act of defiance would be catalogued, and then they would come. They would end what they started. Elias rose from his makeshift shelter, scanning the distant ridges. Varesh 7 had once been a paradise of biodiversity, a jewel of untamed wilderness. Now, the excavation sites had turned it into a wasteland, scars of strip mining stretching for miles. The corporations didn't care about the destruction they left in their wake. Resources were the only gods they worshipped. He clenched his fists. He had spent too many years documenting the destruction, helpless against it. But now, for the first time, he wasn't just an observer, A rustling behind him. He turned sharply. Aeyla was awake, struggling to rise on shaky limbs. Her telepathic voice was weaker than before, but still there, still fighting. "We must move." She felt it too, the inevitable hunt. Elias grabbed his satchel, packing up the last of his medical supplies. "I know, but where?" He had no contacts off-world willing to defy corporate law, no safe haven. The only way to protect her was to fight back. A sharp, whirring sound cut through the air. Elias froze. Drones. His body moved before thought, dragging. Aeyla down behind the crumbling remains of a tree trunk. The machines hovered above the ridge, sleek and predatory, scanning the ground with pulsing red optics. He knew their type: automated patrol units, designed to identify, track, and eliminate. Unauthorized biological entities. Ayla's breathing was ragged. She was in no shape to run. Elias pulled his pulse pistol from his holster. He had never fired at a corporation machine before, never openly defied them. He had spent his career skirting the edges of their authority, careful not to step over the line. But now he was past the point of no return. The first drone drifted lower. A targeting system locked onto their position. Elias fired. The shot rang through the air, a flash of energy slicing through the night. The drone exploded in a burst of orange light, its remains scattering across the dirt. The second drone veered, sharply adjusting its trajectory. Aeyla moved. Despite her injuries, she lunged, eyes glowing with something raw and primal. A shockwave pulsed through the air, not sound, not force, but something deeper, something telepathic. The drone shuddered, its flight faltering, optics flickering wildly. Then, in a burst of static, it dropped from the sky like a stone. Elias turned to her, stunned. "You did that?" Ayla's body trembled, exhaustion taking hold once more. Not alone. She had tapped into something, a lingering connection, a fragment of power that shouldn't have existed, not after her kind had been exterminated. Elias holstered his gun and moved quickly. He slung his satchel over his shoulder and lifted Aeyla as gently as he could. They couldn't stay here. They had just announced themselves to the entire corporate security force, and now they would be hunted. The night was long. Elias pushed forward through the broken terrain, Aeyla leaning against him for support. He ignored the burning in his muscles, the ache in his legs. He had one goal: reach the old research outpost. It had been abandoned years ago when the corporations declared Vareshi 7 a failed investment. The perfect place to disappear, at least for a little while. Ayla's breathing was steady but weak. She had drained herself using that psychic burst, and he didn't know if she could do it again. His mind was racing. The corporations had lied. The Vareshi weren't just predators. They were something far more dangerous, something powerful, and that was why they had been wiped out. The question was, why now? Why had the corporations made sure to kill every last one? What had they been afraid of? Aeyla stirred beside him. "They took more than our lives," she murmured. "They took our memory." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" She struggled, but the words came. "They did not just kill us, they severed us. Our kind. We were connected, a mind that spanned the planet. But they broke it." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. The corporations hadn't just committed genocide. They had erased something fundamental about the Vareshi. And if Aeyla was still alive, still fighting, that meant not everything had been lost. They reached the outpost by dawn. A rusted, crumbling facility hidden beneath layers of dust and vines. Elias wasted no time securing the entrance, setting up what little defenses he could manage. Aeyla collapsed onto the floor, her breathing heavy. He knelt beside her, checking her wounds. She was healing, but slowly, too slowly. He exhaled. They needed a plan. They needed allies. But most of all, they needed answers, because something told him This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The outpost was silent, the stale air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Elias crouched beside Aeyla, listening to her labored breaths as he worked to stabilize her condition. The abandoned facility was little more than a skeleton of rusted metal and cracked concrete, but it was shelter. At least for now. Outside, the storm of corporate pursuit had begun. The drones they had destroyed had triggered a response. Elias had intercepted the transmission before they had gone dark. Corporate security teams were inbound, armed, trained, and authorized to eliminate any biological anomalies. Aeyla stirred, her body trembling. The psychic outburst from before had drained her, but the fire in her violet eyes remained. "They come," her voice whispered in his mind, weaker than before. "They know we are here." Elias clenched his fists. He knew. He had heard the encrypted communications flickering through his scanner. A rapid deployment team, ETA 15 minutes. No reinforcements, no escape. His hand hovered over his pistol. He had spent his entire career as an observer, a scientist. He had never fired on another human before, never stood in open defiance of the corporate machine. But now, cornered and hunted, the only thing that mattered was survival. He turned to Aeyla. "Can you still fight?" She blinked, struggling to lift her head. "I am weak, but I will not fall." He nodded. That would have to be enough. Elias moved quickly, setting up the few defenses available. Old power cells, jury-rigged EMPs, anything to slow the incoming strike team. But it wouldn't hold them for long. The ground trembled as the first ship descended, a sleek black dropship, its hull gleaming beneath Vareshi 7's hazy atmosphere. Then another, and another. 3 strike teams. They had sent an entire kill squad. Elias braced himself against the console. His heart pounded as he watched the first figures emerge. He recognized Duran Rask immediately. The corporate enforcer strode forward with the precision of a man who had done this too many times before. His armor was marked with insignias of past campaigns, all of them victories. His rifle was sleek, compact, far more advanced than anything Elias had ever held. He had been sent to clean up. A comm line crackled. "Dr. Carter." Rask's voice was smooth, calculated. "We know you're in there. We know what you've done." Elias gritted his teeth. "Step out now, and you might still have a future." Aeyla shifted beside him, her presence barely more than a whisper in his mind. "They will not let you live." He knew she was right. He reached for his pistol, gripping it tightly. No more running. The first breach charge detonated. The entrance to the outpost exploded inward, metal and debris scattering as the strike team pushed forward. Elias fired first. His pulse pistol sent a searing bolt into the first soldier through the breach, dropping him instantly. Another followed, but the rest adapted fast, returning fire. Sparks and shrapnel erupted around him as he ducked behind cover, his mind racing. Aeyla moved. Despite her weakened state, she lunged, not with physical strength, but with something far older, far more dangerous. A shockwave rippled through the air, not sound, not force, but something deeper. The nearest soldier stumbled mid-step, his weapon clattering to the ground as his body seized violently. His scream was cut short as his mind simply shut off. Rask didn't flinch. He had expected this. "Deploy countermeasures," he barked. A second later, the air hummed with distortion. Elias felt it immediately, a pulse of energy, cold and empty, spreading through the room. Aeyla shuddered, her body convulsing as if something unseen had torn through her mind. They had brought psionic disruptors. Elias caught her as she collapsed, her breath ragged. Rask and his men closed in, their weapons trained. Rask tilted his head. "You really should have taken my offer, Carter." Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing. Think. The outpost, the old systems, there, a manual reactor overload. It was a suicide move, but it was the only one left. He lunged for the console. Don't! Rask's rifle pressed against his temple. A tense silence stretched between them. Then a pulse, not from Aeyla, not from Elias, from beneath the ground. A deep, resonant tremor, like the awakening of something ancient and long buried. The walls of the outpost shook, dust cascading from the ceiling. Rask's men faltered. What the hell is that? Elias's breath caught. He knew. The Vareshi weren't gone. The corporation had tried to erase them, but something had survived. Buried, waiting, and now the last surviving wolf had called them back. The ground split apart, and the war began. The ground beneath them shuddered violently, deep fractures splitting the scorched earth as something long buried stirred to life. A resonant hum filled the air, not mechanical, not artificial, but organic, something deeply rooted in the world itself. Rask's men stumbled back, their weapons twitching as the earth split open. From the fissures, shadows moved, liquid and shifting, until they took shape. Not fully corporeal, but echoes of something lost, something returning. The Vareshi, not just Aeyla, not just one survivor. They had never been eradicated, only dormant, forced into the depths of their own dying world, severed from their psychic bonds. But now, called by one of their own, they were awake. A pulse ripped through the outpost, not from Aeyla, not from Elias, but from the planet itself. The corporate soldiers convulsed mid-step, their minds fracturing under the force of something they had never been meant to comprehend. Rask alone remained standing, his grip on his rifle white-knuckled, his expression a mask of disbelief. He had been sent here to eliminate a threat, to tie up a loose end, but what he faced now was something beyond human control. Elias dragged Aeyla to her feet, his heart pounding. The energy in the air was electric, crackling like a storm about to break. The Vareshi surrounded them, no longer just wolves, but shadows of a civilization that had once ruled this planet, their forms flickering between flesh and something more than flesh. Ayla's voice, no longer weak, no longer fragile, boomed through the space between them. You took our world. The air grew dense, reality itself warping at the edges of her words. You silenced our voices. Elias felt the pressure build in his skull, a force too immense, too old to be contained by language alone. Aeyla stepped forward, her body no longer trembling with exhaustion, but radiating with power. Her fur shimmered with the bioluminescent glow Elias had seen before, but now it spread, the patterns pulsing in sync with the reawakening of her people. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a conduit. The Vareshi were not a species that had gone extinct. They had been waiting. Rask's breath hitched, his trigger finger twitching. He was afraid. For the first time, he understood. This was not a mission. This was not a simple extermination order. This was a reckoning. Elias turned to Aeyla, barely able to process what was happening, but knowing one thing for certain: there was no going back. What happens now? He whispered. Ayla's gaze flickered toward him, her expression unreadable, the glow of her markings casting long shadows against the ruined outpost. We decide. And then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the Vareshi struck. Reality. Fractured, a pulse of psionic energy tore through the battlefield, not as an attack, but as a command. The soldiers dropped their weapons, their minds buckling under the weight of something older, stronger, undeniable. They were not killed, they were removed. Their presence was no longer permitted. One by one, they collapsed, unconscious, their minds erased of the knowledge of what they had seen, a mercy or a warning. It didn't matter. The corporation would receive only silence from their missing strike team. Rask was the last to fall. His rifle clattered from his hands as his knees hit the ground, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His eyes met Elias's, and in that moment, the scientist saw understanding, not defiance, not anger, just fear. Then, with a whisper of power, Rask too was gone. The battlefield was silent. Elias turned to Aeyla, his breath unsteady. The Vareshi... His voice was hoarse, his mind still struggling to process the scale of what had just happened. "You've won." Ayla's gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon where the first hints of new life had begun to stir. Plants, long thought dead, were pushing through the cracked earth. The ecosystem had suffered, but it had not perished, just like them. "No," she murmured, "not yet." Elias followed her gaze. Varesh 7 was waking up, and the universe would notice. The air on Varesh 7 had changed, no longer lifeless, no longer suffocated by the scars of corporate greed. The first signs of renewal crept through the broken terrain, tiny green shoots pushing through fractured soil, the whisper of unseen winds shifting over ancient ruins. Elias stood at the edge of a ridge, staring down at the land that had once been a graveyard. Now it pulsed with something unspoken, something that had been missing for too long. Life. Aeyla stood beside him, the glow of her bioluminescent patterns fainter now, but steady. The bond between them remained, unspoken, but undeniable. They had survived, but survival was not victory. "The corporation will come back," Elias murmured. Ayla's violet eyes narrowed. "Let them." He let out a tired breath, his mind racing through the implications. The corporate forces would notice the silence. They would investigate why an elite kill squad had vanished without a trace. And when they found nothing but a reawakening world, when they realized that their purge had failed, they would send more, stronger forces, heavier weapons. Elias clenched his fists. He had never been a soldier. But now he had no choice. "What happens next?" he asked. Aeyla turned toward him, her expression unreadable, but her presence thrumming with quiet certainty. "You tell me, Elias Carter," she whispered, her voice threading through his thoughts like a distant storm on the horizon. "Your kind has burned countless worlds, destroyed what you did not understand, but you chose differently." She stepped forward, the glow of her markings flickering with the energy of something ancient, something not fully awakened yet. "The Vareshi have returned," she continued. "But our war is not over." Elias exhaled, staring up at the darkened sky. He could already see it. The corporate warships, the fleets that would one day arrive, the bureaucrats who would decide that Varesh 7 was a threat. The universe did not fear extinction. It feared change. He met Ayla's gaze, feeling the weight of something far bigger than himself settle onto his shoulders. "Then we fight," he said. "We show them what happens when they push too far." A slow, knowing smile spread across Ayla's face. "Yes," she murmured, "we will." In the distance, beyond the ruins of a broken world, the first howls rose into the sky. Not just Aeyla. The Vareshi were waking, and humanity was about to learn the price of its arrogance. Elias Carter had come to Varesh 7 as an observer. Now he was part of the war to come.